everyone, it's Michael Shermer. Before we start the show today, I wanted to tell you about our big upcoming event here in Santa Barbara. December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Friday night, we're doing an open house right here in the office where I'm recording all this. I got a food truck coming and adult beverages. Going to be big fun. We're all just going to hang out. And then Saturday and Sunday, I have some terrific guests coming. I have Michael Schellenberger, who's going to be a live podcast guest. We're going to record it live at the hotel at the Hilton Beachside Resort, right on Cabrillo, here in Santa Barbara. So give them a call, reserve your room, and go to skeptic.com, and right on the top banner, you'll see the conference. Be sure to sign up before it sells out. Michael Schellenberger is one of the most interesting people working today, independent journalist. He ran for governor of California. He works on homelessness. He works on nuclear power. He works on the environment, and most importantly, he works on social media. He was one of the guys that got the Twitter files from Elon and went through and found all the interesting things that were going on at Twitter before Elon bought it. So we'll be talking about all those issues and more, and getting your feedback. That is, these live podcast recordings will have a good portion of the time spent interacting with you, the audience. We're going to do that also Sunday morning with Jared Diamond, the great Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Collapse, and so forth. He's coming up from LA. He's going to spend the part of the day with us, and we're going to do another live recording, podcast recording, which I'll be in conversation with him. And then again, your dialogue with Jared will also be recorded and posted on the show here. And then finally, I got Pete Boghossian coming, who's going to do a street epistemology with all of us. That is to say, he's going to see what it would take to change your mind on various issues. For example, I'm guessing most of the people coming to the conference are the same people who watch this show, read the Skeptic magazine and so on. They're probably atheists or agnostics. So what would it take for you to be a theist? Okay, so Pete's going to try a little street epistemology on us, which will be big fun. Go to skeptic.com, just click on that banner across the top, sign up before it sells out. It's going to be a terrific, big fun. Oh, and then Sunday afternoon, for those who can't make it to the open house Friday night, we'll do it again here. Another food truck coming, adult beverages, going to be big fun. See you then. All righty, everybody. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. This is a special one, which we'll be releasing on November 22nd, 2023, the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, which astonishingly is still a huge topic. Here it is 10 years ago. We did a special issue of Skeptic on the 50th anniversary of JFK, and apparently there's still some questions that are continuing to interest people. So my guests today are Burt W. Griffin, the Warren Commission Assistant Counsel to the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, popularly known as the Warren Commission, and had primary responsibility for investigating and writing the section of the Commission's report in 1964 on whether Jack Ruby was engaged in a conspiracy to assassinate either JFK, Lee Harvey Oswald, or both. He lives in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Here's his new book, by the way, that just came out on this topic, appropriately titled JFK, Oswald, and Ruby, Politics, Prejudice, and Truth. All right, Gerald Posner is award-winning journalist, has written 12 books, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. His 2015 book, God's Bankers, A 200-Year History of the Finances of the Vatican, was an acclaimed New York Times bestseller, and he's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, Newsweek, Time, and, by the way, Skeptic magazine. You've seen him on History Channel, CNN, CBS, MSNBC, and Fox News. And he's done a number of other books, including Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray and the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Secrets of the Kingdom, the inside story of the Saudi-U.S. connection, and Mengele, the complete story. As well as Hitler's Children, Sons and Daughters of Leaders of the Third Reich. There's much more there, but he was on the show a few months ago talking about some of these other topics. My third guest is Michel Gagné, who teaches courses in critical thinking, political philosophy, philosophy of religion, and ethics in the Humanities Department of Champlain College, St. Lambert, a junior college located near Montreal, Canada. He has an MA in history from Concordia University with a thesis on civil rights protests in Northern Ireland during the 1960s. Ah, yes, the Troubles. He's published articles in Skeptic, the National Post, the Encyclopedia of Religion and Violence, and is the author of Thinking Critically about the Kennedy Assassination, Debunking the Myths and conspiracy. He's also the creator and host of the popular Paranoid Planet podcast. Very appropriate for today. Gerald and Michelle, I'm sorry, your books are in a box somewhere. We moved our office, so I couldn't pull them out. I'm really sorry about that. But we will.
I have one behind me here.
So. Okay, there we go. Yeah, there it is. Nicely done. All right, let's start with the big picture, gentlemen. Why are we still talking about this subject? And maybe Judge Griffin, you go first, because my father always said, if you're ever standing before a judge, make sure you're properly deferent and respectful. So you go first. Why are we still talking about this 60 years later?
Well, look at it. It was a sensation. We're still talking about Abraham Lincoln. So he was he was a very, very popular and attractive figure. I guess we don't talk about Garfield and McKinley because perhaps they weren't as popular.
Right, but there's something about Kennedy is that you're referring to, I guess, is the almost mythic stature of being cut down and what he represented to the American public. And, had he just played out his presidency and maybe won a second term and just kind of ground through fighting with Congress like all presidents have to, it would have just been like George W. Bush or H.W. Bush or Reagan or whatever. But instead, he's almost this Christ-like Messiah figure.
Well, maybe some others want to chime in. I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, okay. Gerald?
I think, in part, we're talking about it 60 years later. Evidenced in a snapshot of a poll the other day by Gallup that shows 29% of Americans think that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president alone. Although that may seem a pretty good percentage compared to the 5 or 6% it was after Oliver Stone's JFK in 1990. It's still a pretty dismal figure. So 2/3 of the public, all these years later, after the work of the Warren Commission, after, books as good as what Michel has written last year, his book on critical, reasoning and logic applying to the case, Judge Griffin's new book, which I hardly endorse to everybody because he has the perspective of somebody involved in the original investigation. He adds to it in this book. Notwithstanding all of this, conspiracy theories are popular. They remain wildly, successful on many different topics, and they cling to the Kennedy assassination like glue. So we can't quite get the history right on that, and that's why I think we're still talking about it 6 decades later.
Yeah. Michelle?
Well, Kennedy was such a polarizing figure at the time, but people don't realize that. His death created a myth around him, partly because Mrs. Kennedy kind of created this myth of Camelot, and then it got amplified in conspiracy theories where he became more than King Arthur, but became almost what I call Jesus 2.0. I think you mentioned something like that there, too. So the thing about Kennedy, I think, is he becomes a very powerful myth that we can all use to describe the causes of evil in our world. And, everybody likes a dying hero and a kind of an ultimate cause to fight for. Now, Kennedy represented a lot of causes, but sometimes the ones that are attached to him, like, say, making peace with the Soviets, actually is not true. So people, I think, use him as a foil for being able to find purpose in life. Myths do that. They allow us to identify evil and good clearly and to present ourselves and our values as part of the good. So Kennedy, I think, becomes more of a tool to do that than an actual historical interest that many people who like Kennedy bother to research.
I think that's true, Michelle, but I also think there's a factor here, and of course it's Judge Griffin's specialty. One of the reasons I think that this case in particular, it's not just Kennedy, but it's the fact that the assassin arrested is killed 48 hours later by somebody who looks like he's out of central casting, for a mafia movie when you look at him. And so that ending for the public makes everybody suspicious. And until you get, and there's no soundbite, there's no 30-second way to explain Jack Ruby and Oswald very easily. So it's complicated. And I think that Ruby adds a level to this, that if Oswald had been tried, convicted, and was in prison now, he'd be 84 years old and he was saying, I'm still innocent, there would be people that would listen to him, but it wouldn't be the same as Ruby having done that.
Well, let me throw in another factor, which is I think people love a mystery, and they're more intrigued with a mystery than often the truth. Even though when we deal with the truth in this case, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I do think the unsolved mysteries here. I'll just read you this quote from Lieutenant Commander Alex Diedrich. She was one of the pilots that filmed one of those UAPs. So she's been involved in the whole business of, what is the government really doing with those UAPs? And her conclusion was, I think they enjoy the anticipation more than actually finding answers. That is the ufologists. And I think it's the same way here with conspiracy theorists. It's like solving it would be boring. Oh, this is what happened. Oh, okay. Instead, just keeping it going like that is part of it.
Well, Michael, let me interrupt though here. When one looks at who the assassin was, which was Lee Harvey Oswald, and you get into his life is actually fascinating. Mm-hmm. And his there's even an element of sex in it. But people still seem to like a mystery more than they like sex.
Okay. I'm not sure about the sex connection there, but in any case, well, and I guess Ruby with the strip clubs too as well. Yeah. But on the other counterfactual, let's say someone like John Hinckley shoots Reagan and Reagan doesn't die. And it just goes down, well, he's obviously a mentally deranged lone nut. He said he did it to impress Jodie Foster. Okay. Had Reagan died, would people be pouring through the life of Hinckley and, who he knew and connected to the CIA or whatever?
Well, if Reagan had died and Hinckley had been killed 2 days later by somebody with ties to a white supremacist group or whatever, or rumors of it, we'd be off and running, right? So I think that's almost the capsule you have to put in. Plus, Hinckley is tackled at the scene. We know he's the shooter. What if Hinckley had fired from a rifle from a couple of blocks away, hit Reagan, and escaped in the immediate aftermath of the assassination? Then we catch him that afternoon after he kills a policeman, and then he gives the Jodie Foster story and then is killed 2 days later. Boy, I'll tell you, I think we'd be almost at the same point.
Yeah.
I could interject, but although this is Gerald's domain, James Earl Ray has the same kind of mystique around him. Many people still believe he was innocent of Martin Luther King's killing, but no one seems to wonder whether Saran shot Bobby Kennedy. Right. Yeah, the lack of knowing, the lack of information, I think allows many people to fit in their own scenario, their own pet theory about why this happened the way it did.
And may I say another factor with respect to Oswald is that he was a Marxist. And the one person that J. Edgar Hoover would have loved to have caught and framed would have been a Marxist.
Right. Do you think there's something of a disproportionality of cause and effect where, the leader of the free world is brought down by a lone nut, a nobody? Same thing with Princess Diana, cause of death, drunk driving, speeding, no seatbelt, very quotidian. But, princesses are not supposed to die like that. So Kennedy, there had to be something to match his stature. CIA, FBI, KGB, the mafia and so on. You start adding elements to balance the proportions there.
William Manchester said it very well in Death of a President, when he has that part where he says, if you look back at the World War II and you look at the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish victims on the victim side of the scale. On the other side, you have the Nazis, and there's a rough balance, worse crime, worse criminals. But with Kennedy, like you said, you have Camelot, the best and the brightest, this great potential for the future, young, charismatic president. On the other side of the scale, you have 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, and it doesn't seem to balance. If you put a conspiracy on the Oswald side of the scale, he had to be killed because Kennedy was going to disband the CIA, or the Cubans had to kill him because the mafia was trying to kill Castro. It gives some meaning to the death and makes people feel better.
Yeah.
I think the context also is very important. Burt and I were chatting on my own podcast, which will, I guess, be airing around the same time as this one. And, General Walker and a lot of the anti-Kennedy hatreds in Dallas lent itself perfectly well for thinking that right-wingers had killed Kennedy. Even Mrs. Kennedy that evening said, that her husband didn't have the decency of being killed for civil rights. It had to be a silly little communist. So even the people who were there had trouble believing that it was one Marxist with one gun. It had to be something more in their minds, because that was not the issue at hand that day. Everybody thought right-wing violence was the problem in Dallas.
Good point.
Yeah. Judge, you were old enough to be part of all this. I've never talked to anybody on the Warren Commission. Take us back to November 22nd, 1963. Where were you? What did you experience when you heard the news? And how did you get involved in the Warren Commission?
Well, I was a young lawyer in Cleveland, and it was shortly after lunch. I was coming back from lunch, getting on the elevator in my office building, and someone said, "The president has been shot." And I must have, in some way or other, known that he was in Texas. But in any event, my reaction was, those damn segregationists. And that was my initial reaction. Like everybody else, I spent the weekend watching television and saw Oswald on television being shot by Jack Ruby. But then our life went on. It was approaching the Christmas season, and somebody called me at the latter part of December, who I had known, who was had been a lawyer in Cleveland. That's my hometown. He'd been a lawyer in Cleveland, and he had left the law firm that he was with to become an assistant to Robert Kennedy. And he called me because, interestingly enough, this was 1963, and they were looking for diversity on the Warren Commission staff. Well, wow. There were no women on the Warren Commission staff. There was only one black lawyer on the Warren Commission staff, but diversity in those days was geographic diversity. And so he was from the Midwest working for Robert Kennedy. And I was probably the only lawyer he knew who had any criminal prosecution background. And I had gone to the right law school and had the right academic record. And I was 31 years old at the time. And after I made sure that he hadn't dialed the wrong number, I called my wife, and she was packing our bags already. So I got on the Warren Commission staff.
Amazing. Yeah, that must have been...
And Judge Griffin, I have a question for you. It's a broad one, so it won't be an easy answer. But, there's this theory that conspiracists like to talk about, that the Warren Commission was directed, in essence, to come to a conclusion. The conclusion was lone assassin, find no conspiracy, and you just fit the evidence into that so that was the report that could be delivered a year later. Could you just give us an idea of what actually went on there and in the search for what you were looking for in the truth?
Well, let me put it in two perspectives. The first staff meeting that we had with Chief Justice Warren, he told our staff, "Your only client is the truth." And that stayed with us. Indeed, I was surprised that when Gerald Ford wrote his account of the investigation of the Warren Commission work, and Gerald Ford was a member of the Warren Commission. He was one of the commissioners. He remembered that statement from Warren. But the second one was this: we wanted to find a conspiracy. If first of all, the nation's safety was at stake. If someone else was involved besides the people who were presently accused, we had to know it. And I want you to know that I've said to people on other occasions, if I could have found a conspiracy, I would have been the senator from Ohio and not John Glenn.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I've often said to people, and it's absolutely true, that as a reporter, as a journalist, when I did the book 30 years after you had done worked on the Warren Commission, I also I hoped it was possible to come up with the credible evidence of a conspiracy. It'd be a much bigger story if I could convince Michelle, Michael, and other people looking at it that this was the evidence. Dan Rather and Peter Brokaw and at that time Peter Jennings, they were the anchors. It didn't happen. So you end up following the evidence for what it is. But yes, of course, if you can find the evidence of a conspiracy, it would be a fool who would not be putting that right up front.
And can I say that in the mid-90s, I was one of those conspiracists who hated the books that Burt and Gerald had written, to the point that I remember being in the studio of Black Op Radio with Leno Sanik, vilifying Peter Jennings and ABC News and Gerald Posner and the Warren Report. And then eventually I had to realize I was wrong, right? So I thank you very much, because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants just for being here today. That
Well,
they ended up writing much more compelling information.
Well, Michel, how did you find out that you were wrong?
Yeah.
I was teaching about the Kennedy assassination, and I was wondering why I got so riled up trying to defend the idea that Fletcher Prouty was an epistemic authority. Because I hadn't really read about him. I had only read what he wrote. And, Fletcher Prouty being in the Air Force, being kind of the star character in Oliver Stone's film, I figured, well, someone in the Pentagon must be able to know what the CIA does. But later on, reading about Fletcher Prouty and reading his own books directly, I started being a little bit suspicious. It sounded like, the Protocols of Zion without the Jews. And then little by little, I realized that I think I've made the mistake that I tell my students not to do, which is to go with your gut and trust the information that that you hear first. And the problem was that I was very quick to debunk other conspiracy theories, but Kennedy played a trick on me to the point that when 9/11 happened, my first instinct was the men who killed Kennedy did this. So it took a few years for me to realize a jet did hit the Pentagon. There were no bombs in the buildings. So deconstructing 9/11, and I have to thank Michael a bit for this, because he was in this A&E special that I saw, and he said Oswald was a nobody, and I was angry. I was like, Oswald wasn't a nobody. He worked for the CIA. But then I realized, teaching these college students, that conspiracy theories are bunk, except for the Kennedy assassination. It forced me to do what I was asking them to do in their essays. So I actually took the Warren Report home one Christmas, and I start my book with that. I was actually sitting in the bathtub about 20 feet from this room here, and I was reading the chapter on I think it was on the bullet, and I was looking for that magic bullet, and I couldn't find it, because of course you guys never talked about a magic bullet. It didn't zigzag, it didn't do any of these things. Oliver Stone had to lie, and I think that was where the click came. Why does Oliver Stone need to lie to convince me that this is the story that happened? So eventually I thought maybe I should read Gerald Posner. When Bugliosi's book came out, I was hesitant because it was so fat, but eventually I found a copy of it and I started reading it, and it deconstructed. So by 2011 or so, I think I had migrated to the skeptical side, and I haven't changed since. I'm even more convinced, having spent 10 years writing this book of mine.
But it's very rare. Yeah, it's very rare, though. I do think that, for somebody to have an open mind on the case, because people get locked into a position on different subjects. And the Kennedy assassination is almost a religion at times. So you can't shake somebody. And so, if you can't agree on the facts, people are, passionate about it, but unmovable in many instances.
Yeah.
So
Michael, my instinct was...
May I be a questioner here?
Yeah, please.
Michael, and ask you, how did your thought process change or evolve?
Oh, interesting. Well, I was not a buff in either direction. When we started the Skeptic magazine in '92, and conspiracy theories is kind of one of the beats of skepticism, and then the JFK film came out. And, it's such a good film, and Oliver Stone is such an amazing filmmaker that I thought, well, gosh, if only, like half of this is true, or 10% of it's true, there just has to be something, because he just connects like every possible dot. And you put in all the music and the great acting and superstars, and it's like, wow. And, and then I just started reading stuff, and then I read Gerald's book and went, oh, never mind. So, but Michel's story is important because it shows that you can reason people out of beliefs that they arrived at for non-rational reasons. It does happen, and that's good. Now, back to the Gerald's question, Judge. You'll often hear from conspiracists, well, come on, Alan Dulles was on the Warren Commission. This guy hated Kennedy. Kennedy was going to dismantle the CIA, and Alan Dulles had every reason in the world to want Kennedy dead. And how did he get on that commission? Come on. And then behind closed doors, he must have been pulling strings and nudging you guys to find certain things. That's the story you hear.
Well, it's my understanding, and I probably got it from Gerald, from reading Gerald's book, that Robert Kennedy actually recommended Dulles for membership of the commission. It made some sense, actually. He had been the head of the CIA. He'd been involved in questions of possible foreign conspiracies for years. So he was a logical person to have, but I think it's significant, as we know later, that Robert Kennedy actually recommended him. What do you think, Gerald?
Yeah, and Judge Griffin, you're right. It was Bobby Kennedy who recommended Allen Dulles. Now, that's the fact, so that's what I say in case closed. I don't, in case closed, then go off in the next sentence to in between the lines or what my speculation is, but I'll give you my speculation here for what it's worth, because I can't get into Bobby Kennedy's head, and I don't know this from documents. But I think one of the reasons, there are probably multiple reasons that he wanted Dulles on, but one reason is that Allen Dulles was one of the few people in the government, together with Bobby and a handful, that knew about the plots between the CIA and the Mafia to kill Castro. And I think that Bobby wanted Allen Dulles there to make sure the information didn't somehow pop out to the commission. He was the one to make sure that that story didn't get there, because it wasn't a story. They were still continuing it at that moment. They thought they would continue to try to kill Castro, although it never got done again. And they didn't want that public. And I think that one of the things that Dulles could do was make sure that you didn't stumble into that particular story. They wanted you focused on who killed Jack, not on who was trying to kill Fidel.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you'll often hear things about that where Dulles did this and he was behind the scenes doing that. And the cover-up is not who really killed Kennedy. The cover-up is what the CIA was actually doing in other countries.
Right.
Right. rigging elections and favoring the fascist dictator over the communist dictator, all this stuff that came out later.
Well, Michael, there
sorry,
were two important cover-ups. One was the fact, as you've just mentioned, that the CIA and Allen Dulles and Robert Kennedy never told the Warren Commission that the CIA was attempting to assassinate Castro. But the second one is the note that was given or provided to the FBI at the FBI headquarters in Dallas 10 days before the assassination, threatening Special Agent James Hosty, which was ultimately deliberately destroyed by the FBI after Oswald was killed. Those are two very important concealments.
Yeah. So, okay.
Can I add a third?
Yeah, please go ahead.
There's a very third important concealment. I don't know if we call it a conspiracy, but certainly it's a kind of a cover-up. And this one revolves around the Kennedy family. I had Kathy Olmsted on my podcast. Also, Robert Dallek, historian Robert Dallek, both pointed out that, the Kennedys were very tight-lipped about the autopsy materials. There was an entire legacy to protect. And so it wasn't just the assassination attempts on Castro. It was also anything that pertained to the Kennedy family's image, particularly whether or not, and it's still up for debate, but whether or not Kennedy had venereal disease. He certainly had Addison's disease. He was taking a lot of painkillers at the time for his back. So that back brace, no one really talked about it for a while, but it may have actually played a very important role in him getting hit in the head. He didn't fall over when he was first hit in the neck. So there are a lot of things there that I think Bobby Kennedy shows a subterfuge, including the disappearance of the brain and tissue smears and naked pictures from the autopsy materials that disappeared at a time when only Bobby Kennedy had a key and access. And the HSCA researched this back in 1978. So the people like Oliver Stone who keep talking about this disappearing brain, if they want to find a culprit, Bobby Kennedy's the best one because all evidence points towards him, right? So there's that third element of protecting the legacy of the family as well as the FBI and the CIA.
What about that quote after the Bay of Pigs where Kennedy said, "I want to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces"? That's often trotted out as that he intended to dismantle the CIA. Are you guys familiar with that?
Yes, I am. My feeling on that is, and I've read a lot about it, is that he intended to smash it into 1,000 pieces by remaking it. He wanted to he was furious at what he viewed as the treachery of having led him and given him advice and information and intelligence that led him into the Bay of Pigs. without the ability to understand that that should have been stopped early on. And so he was in a fury about it. Look at Jack Kennedy was very smart. He didn't become president at a young age because he was playing, without a lot of good political common sense and intuition. He understood that you could not be in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. He had a standoff in '62 with the Russians over the Cuban Missile Crisis and not have an intelligence agency. You need an intelligence agency. So people think he was going to disband the CIA and sort of run America without an intelligence agency. We just would have the FBI do some domestic work, have to put themselves back into the middle of that period. Of course, there would be a CIA. The question is what it would look like. And I'm sure that bothered some of the people over there who worried that he was going to start meddling. But the idea that they all of a sudden had to sit around a table and say, hey, let's stop him. And I love this part, by the way, for whatever it's worth, and Judge Griffin and Michel will have a comment on it. The CIA at the very highest echelons, we're talking Dulles and the top of the CIA, was in a partnership with another, group that's often thought of by conspirators as being involved in killing JFK, with the mafia at the highest levels of the mafia. They had a partnership to kill a head of state in the early 60s. It wasn't Kennedy, it was Castro. And they failed on 7 or 8 attempts. They didn't even wound him. So the very same Keystone cops that are trying to really get Cuba turned around. I mean, the CIA wants to get rid of communists. The mafia wants their casinos back. They have real incentive to do it. They can't pull it off. We somehow are meant to think that they pulled off the perfect crime in Dallas. Here we are 60 years later. They fooled all of us, and they fooled many other people. 29% of the American public still believes the story. I just don't see the incompetence that's displayed on the attempts to Castro suddenly were transformed into James Bond and a Hollywood version of it in Dallas.
Right.
Well, look at the starting point of whether or not there was a conspiracy is with Lee Oswald. And the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that Lee Oswald shot President Kennedy. There were 2 eyewitnesses to the shooting from the 6th floor window. Oswald fled the building. He winds up within an hour of the shooting of President Kennedy, killing Officer J.D. Tippit. He then flees and winds up in the Texas Theater. When he's ultimately caught within the hour of the assassination of President Kennedy at the Texas Theater, he tries to kill the arresting officer, pulls his gun and tries to kill him. Now look at, as Chief Justice Warren said to us at one point, not in my conversation, but it was told to me that he said it to one of the other staff people, that Warren, who had been the chief county prosecutor in Alameda County, Oakland, for 10 years, that Warren himself said that if he could have prosecuted that case, he would have got a conviction of Oswald in 3 days. And I don't think there are many criminal defense lawyers that would want to have defended this case against Oswald. So
Mark Lane. Mark Lane would have been. Mark Lane would have been volunteering. He was jumping at the chance. One thing, Judge Griffin, if I can just ask.
Yeah.
Here we are. We are in the middle of the Cold War. You do have a fellow who defected to the Soviet Union. He's an avowed Marxist, and his wife is a Russian. Were you worried that Marina, in the commission end, might have a tie to the KGB? She could be a Russian asset, that it could lead to a Russian involvement in the plot?
Well, certainly, that was the first question, but and that's why I say there's a sex story here also, but she was a 19-year-old. Hold me to this now. She was born in 1941. She married Oswald in 60 or 61. So she was 19. She was 19 years old, I think, at the time. And for a lot of reasons, her life was not a good one. She was basically an orphan. And he was not, believe it or not, he was not an unattractive guy. So that there was a sexual attraction there between both of them.
That's what
and I think that's the beginning of the sex story.
Did she not testify for you?
Oh yes, she testified extensively,
Marina.
and her testimony, incidentally, began to change. I think at the beginning, at the beginning, she did not want to reveal everything to us, but I think what ultimately happened, and she has become, as far as the facts are concerned, even to this day, she's been a pretty steady witness. She's changed her view of whether her husband was guilty or innocent, but
How so?
oh, she thinks he was innocent. At the beginning, she was satisfied that he was guilty, but she now thinks he's innocent.
And as a matter of fact, she did, Michael, by the time I was doing the book Case Closed in 92, when I was trying to talk to her and I had some conversation, she never went on the record. She thought then it was a conspiracy. But when you ask her, and this is critical, why have you changed your mind? Why have you gone from thinking that your husband was the lone assassin and thinking it's a conspiracy? She'll tell you, well, he was working for the CIA and they did this with the autopsy pictures. And it's all from what others have told her outside of the case. If you ask her what she knows as a witness, what she knows as Oswald's wife, what she knows about the assassination attempt that he had on Edwin Walker, which she supplies the only testimony for, the backyard photos which she took, which some people thought were fake. She doesn't change any of that. When she talks about the night before when he comes to get the rifle before the murder and the fight that they had and what a mean mood he was in and everything. So none of that has changed. She hasn't recanted any of that. And so her testimony about what she knows, you have to separate from what she's been told. So yes, she's been persuaded to think there's something grander here than what she's been told, but she hasn't changed that absolutely telling testimony, which, and you know, she was the one who said that when she went to see him in prison, immediately after when he was locked up in jail, she left there knowing he was guilty because of one thing. She knew him well enough to know the man she married, if they had arrested him on a fake charge, he would have been screaming. He would have been standing up and saying to her, you get somebody in here and get me out of here. And instead he was just like, don't worry, it's going to be fine. This will be okay. And that reaction from him, because he had beaten her, he was very volatile with her, this calm reaction was why she said when she left. And the same thing from his brother, Robert Oswald. Yeah, that's not Lee. We know that that's him doing it.
Michael, can I go
please.
back to the CIA, because I think there's an important piece that we left out. You were asking why Kennedy had said, allegedly, because this was all said anonymously by someone to the press, that he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Even if he said that, the issue is they both agreed they want to get rid of Castro, and the disagreement was largely over methods. The CIA had bitten off more than it could chew by training anti-Castro Cubans who were incredibly neglectful. I mean, the planes left Honduras an hour late because they didn't actually figure in the time difference between, I think it was Honduras and Cuba. So the planes to protect the boats actually showed up late. And the night before, some Cubans are calling home saying, don't worry, Castro won't be there too long. No, so it didn't take too much to put two and two together and somebody to inform on them. So it was, and I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this show,
Sure.
but it was definitely, my Christian sensibilities are harmed here, but it was a shit show. And so Kennedy wanted to avoid any kind of large-scale military action planned by the CIA. But what's interesting is Kennedy wanted to get rid of Castro up until the Cuban Missile Crisis. A second invasion was not necessarily off the books, but they hired General what's his name? General Y in Oliver Stone's movie. What was his name again? Gerald, do you remember?
General LeMay?
No. The guy who had been in Vietnam. Lansdale.
Oh, Lansdale. Yeah.
So General Lansdale was an expert in psychological operations. And this is the person that Bobby Kennedy chooses to organize Operation Mongoose. And it involves like crazy things, like dropping toilet paper from the sky onto Cuba that has Fidel Castro's picture on it, or one-way tickets to Mexico. Lansdale even wanted to shoot star shells on Christmas Eve from a submarine over Havana Harbor and then drop leaflets saying Jesus has come back to the United States, but he won't come to Cuba until you get rid of communism, right? So it was farcical, but that was what actually appealed to the Kennedys. They had read The Ugly American, which was loosely based on Lansdale's adventures in the Philippines and in Vietnam, and they thought, this is great, we'll get rid of Castro this way. So Lansdale's a CIA guy. I mean, he's more Air Force than CIA. who they actually latch on to do all these things, while McCone and the other CIA men are hiring the mafia. So there are a number of different things happening at the same time. They're all trying to get rid of Castro. They just don't agree on the methods. And I think it's important to point that out, because Kennedy was not in a war against the CIA. Once McCone had replaced Dulles, these guys were both Irish Catholics. They got along quite well, but not necessarily seeing the same methods as being the ones that work. And sorry, I've got the sun in my eyes here, so for some reason I feel like I'm a little bit snowblind.
Yeah, no, I always took that break it up into 1,000 pieces line as just typical behind closed doors ranting by presidents. I'm sure W was pissed off about the CIA, missing the 9/11 attacks. How could we not know this? How come you guys weren't talking to those guys? And I'm sure that goes on all the time.
Mm-hmm. Michael, could I ask Judge Griffin two questions, actually related to Ruby? Judge Griffin, the FBI never told you at the time that they had an illegal wiretap on the headquarters of Sam Giancana, that they had put it in right. And if they had, they could have told you that the Chicago mob, when Ruby killed Oswald, those tape recordings of people who did not know they were being listened to were, who is he? Nobody in the Chicago Mafia knew who Ruby was. If they told you that, it would have made your work a little easier, no?
Right. But the fact of the matter is that we attempted to identify what Ruby did from the time that he could have had any awareness that Kennedy was coming to Dallas, but most particularly from the time he heard that the president was shot until he shot Oswald. And we attempted, as almost on a minute-by-minute basis, to determine what Ruby was doing, who he was talking to, what he was saying, and there was absolutely no evidence that he had any connection with somebody who was a mafia-oriented person. Ruby became the first conspiracy investigator himself, because he became obsessed with the idea that Jews were going to be blamed for the assassination. Ruby was Jewish. He changed his name from Rubenstein to Ruby, and he saw on the morning of November 22nd an anti-Kennedy ad with a black border on it, which he interpreted as somehow the black border being connected with the assassination, and it was signed with the name Bernard Weissman. And he recognized Weissman as a Jewish name. So he tried to, and he didn't know of any Bernard Weissman in Dallas. So he became a very good investigator. He looked in the telephone directory and didn't find Bernard Weissman's name in the telephone directory. One of his lawyers, who was a civil lawyer, suggested that he look in a city directory. So he looked in the street directory and didn't find a Bernard Weissman there. And I'm not going to go into this unless somebody's interested, but the Weissman story itself is a fascinating story, because Weissman was a real person, and his story is really worth telling. But we don't have time for the program. I think.
It's in that film you appear in, that the truth is the client, in which he explains that he was one of the rare conservative Jews in Dallas. Most Jews were quite liberal, and so Ruby's partial motive, maybe you suggest this in your book, was to show that Jews are not going to put up with this. We're going to stand up and we're strong, or whatever it is he said.
Well, Michael, when the first thing he basically said. After he was arrested for shooting Oswald, when Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells was asking him why he did it, his answer was, "I had to show the world a Jew had guts."
Yeah.
Look at Ruby was ultimately convicted and given the death penalty. The verdict was reversed on the Court of Appeals, and he died two years later of cancer. Think if Ruby had been involved in a conspiracy, he could have saved his own life by fingering somebody. He didn't do that. He insisted right to the end that he had acted alone.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Gerald.
I was just going to ask the last question, Michael, and then I give it back
Please.
to you
Oh,
since
no,
you're
this is
the
great.
interviewer here. No, Judge Griffin, here's a bit of a scuttlebutt, so I don't have it in case closed. It doesn't matter about the case at all, but you might know because you may have investigated it, not put it in the Warren Commission. When I was back in Dallas in 91, 92, doing interviews, Bill Alexander, who was a local prosecutor there, and others who were involved in the case, a former sheriff, they said that it was known that Ruby was in fact gay, that his roommate, George Senator, he lived with a roommate, but it in fact was his partner. Now, doesn't mean anything about the case because it goes separately, but was that something in 1963 that you would have thought was just like National Enquirer type of material? It didn't matter, or was it something that never came up before the commission in your investigation?
Well, it didn't come up in any particular sense, but Leon Hubert, my colleague, and I thought about that, thought he might be gay, but then the question was, so what? What difference?
Right, no, understood.
Yeah.
Understood. It's just a footnote, and I don't discuss it in case closed, and it was surprising to me that some in Dallas said that, and I wasn't sure if that was their revisionism or whether that was true or whether he just actually had a male roommate because it cut down on the cost of the monthly rent.
On this matter of explaining human behavior, explaining our own behavior, why did you do something? We know from a lot of cognitive studies that people have a hindsight bias in which they just make stuff up of why they did something. Who knows? It was quite random why you did this instead of that or whatever. I was thinking about that with Ruby. Yeah, he said, I want to show the world that a Jew has guts. But he also said, I want to spare Mrs. Kennedy from having to go through a trial. And I love Kennedy. He was my president, and I was so upset. But, so much of it is just random. He just kind of got up that morning and had his gun with him as usual. And then I think, Judge, you said he, minutes before, he had wired money to one of his stripper girls so she could pay her rent. And then, minutes later, he's shooting Oswald, but he might not have done that at all. There's a certain amount of randomness to it.
Michael, even more than that, he brought his dog with him to
right.
to the Western Union office. He parked his car and left his dog in the car, and then got attracted by what was going on with respect to the police station a block away. So he didn't go back to take care of his dog and his car. He went to the police station.
Yeah, it's so interesting what Judge Griffin just said. When people don't understand the importance of that, Sheba, his dog, he was crazy about those dogs. For Jack Ruby, he wasn't just having a couple of dogs. He was crazed about them. And people who knew him told me time and time again, and again, I can't keep, I don't lay it out like that in the book, but they said he would never, if he knew he was going down to do something like the killing Oswald, he was then going to be arrested, he was going to jail, those dogs would have stayed at home with Jack Senator. They would never have been locked in the car with him. And I think those are the little tell signs. There's also something else that the Warren Commission, Judge Griffin does a great job of laying this out. Ruby gets worked up into that frenzy, Michael. Yes, serendipity puts him at that moment out there on Sunday, but his sister, who's the real power, she's the strong one in the family, she kept cranking him up, not to go and kill Oswald. She wasn't doing that, but making him angry, just making him furious about what had happened. And you're right, later he comes up with this justification, but he sort of gets worked up by talking to people, especially his sister that weekend, into this fury.
And he may, Michael, have thought all of those things. He may have been concerned also about Jackie Kennedy's coming to testify. But it wasn't the first thing he mentioned to his lawyers, and I'm not talking about Melvin Belli. I'm talking about the first lawyer who he would have been much better off staying with than Melvin Belli. And in fact, the Ruby trial itself is a disgrace. They indicted Ruby as Jack Rubenstein, aka Jack Ruby. His legal name was Jack Ruby. Look at the anti-Semitism in that.
Yeah, yeah.
The trial judge had a $25,000, which was a lot of money, and he had a $5,000 advance from the publisher in the midst of the trial, and the defense filed a motion for a change of venue. That would have meant the trial would have been moved to another city, the judge would not have been the judge of that case. Can you imagine that kind of ethics? Even in Texas, I can't imagine.
What about the famous Oswald quote, "I'm just a patsy," and some of the other weird things he said?
Yeah, but there was a following statement. "I'm just a patsy," and then he said, "They're after me because I was." These are my words, not his, but as close as I can come to it. That they're after me because I was a defector to the Soviet Union. That was the patsy he was talking about.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things in Oswald's behavior that clearly shows. I mean, Burt and I disagreed on what was his ultimate purpose here, but to me, the fact that he left all this money to his wife with scarcely enough to get out of town suggests that he hadn't really thought it out that well. It's not like this guy greatly cared about his family. He was ready to go to Cuba without them just a few weeks earlier. But that morning, he decided to dump all of the rest of his money on the desk for his wife, left his wedding ring. While in police custody, he says funny things, like when he's asked, "Did you kill the president?" What shocks me, he didn't say, "Gosh, no, I'd never do that." He says, "No one has charged me with that yet." And that's a very big difference. That's someone who says, "Until you can prove it, I'm not admitting this." And that weird fist motion, is he showing his handcuffs? He's clearly giving some kind of a Marxist salute. It's become kind of a Black Panther thing later on, but it's very popular to show the fist sign.
Imagine leaving his wedding ring for his wife. First time he'd ever taken it off, leaves it for his wife, and $175. That's a lot of money in 1963. A lot of money.
I don't know what Michel and Judge Griffin think about this, but Oswald, the night before the assassination, when he goes to get the rifle, has this long conversation with Marina that she recounts afterwards about, "Come back with me," because they'd been separated. "Please come back. I'll buy you a washing machine." It would have been a big expense for them. And she said, I was so mad at him, and I just kept rebuffing him and saying no, no, no. And then while they were sleeping that night, at one point she puts her leg at rest against his and he pushes it away, she said, with such a ferocity that she thought, why? He's in a mean mood. The question is, I've called Oswald at times the equivocal assassin. If Marina had said yes that night, was it all a fake that he was saying to her, "Please come back with me, we can restart our life, let's get this going"? And that if she had said yes, he still would have said, "Forget about it," and gone on to kill the president? Or was it possible that he was not ambivalent about doing the assassination, but that he wasn't this? One of the reasons, Michel, he doesn't have this escape plan is because it's come up only a few days before. He's seen the motorcade route. He's decided to do it. But was it possible that he could have been dissuaded from doing it? He wasn't Sirhan writing in a notebook, "Bobby Kennedy must die, Bobby Kennedy must die, Bobby Kennedy must die." It's a little different with him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in other words, I just think there's a huge element of randomness to it. If it hadn't been JFK, maybe he had been satisfied with assassinating General Walker. Or I think, wasn't there something he wanted to kill Nixon too when Nixon was coming to town? In other words, he's just looking for something, and he just got lucky on the JFK thing.
Yeah, what do you think about that last night, Michel?
See, when we were talking on my podcast, you referred often to Patricia McMillan's book, and I'm sure it's a great book, and I know Gerald quotes from it a lot, and so does Norman Mailer, so I never actually read it, but I got a lot of it through other authors.
Tell us that.
Well, Patricia McMillan spent several months after the assassination befriending Marina Oswald, and so it's a lot of an intimate biography of Marina and Oswald, Lee Oswald's time together. Anything that could not be substantiated by Ruth Paine, for example, often comes through McMillan. And I think McMillan's probably a great author. My problem is I feel that I'm getting secondhand information that may or may not be accurate because Marina, for example, may have guilt issues or other things she doesn't want to admit to. I mean, we know that Ruth Paine was an incredibly honest witness. Judge Griffin pointed that out to me, how she would often come and try to correct the record on the Warren Commission just to make sure that she didn't mislead anybody. Marina's not quite as clear. So I'm less likely to take what Marina says at face value, but I look at things like Oswald's behavior in the police station. I'm particularly interested in how Robert Oswald, his reaction, his interaction with Lee in the time that Lee was incarcerated. They're fairly short, But Robert has a great insight to the fact that he's looking into Lee's face, looking for something to tell him that he didn't do it. And Lee says, don't look for anything, brother. You're not going to find anything there. The fact that he wanted to get John Abt, this lawyer who would defend Marxist extremists, the fact that he always had this admiration for the Rosenbergs, to me, is there was a death wish in Oswald, and he was acting that out impulsively, not necessarily planned. I don't think he was heading for Mexico. He just wanted to either be killed or maybe, somehow evade the law and have someone else get blamed for it, the way that it happened with the attempt he did on General Walker. So he's a very enigmatic person, but at the same time, he's crying out for some kind of a psychological assessment. He's got personality disorders. I'm not an expert in psychology, but I've done some study of that. I've interviewed some psychiatrists, and there's definitely some major issues that are preventing Lee Oswald from thinking the way that most of us think.
Well, yeah, he's probably got some Machiavellianism and psychopathy and delusions of grandeur for sure. But back to the randomness versus it's all plotted out carefully in advance. Like you'll hear conspiracists say, "Oh, come on, that the parade route went right by the book depository building where Oswald just happened to be working, and it was Ruth Payne. Was it Ruth Payne that got him the job there? So she must have been working with the CIA, and there is some connection between Ruth Payne and the CIA through some brother or something or other." They start connecting the dots.
Her sister apparently was a secretary or something like that at the CIA.
Right. Yeah. So, but to speak to the kind of randomness, it may not have happened. He got the job at the book depository building before the parade route was determined, right?
Right.
And the people who planned the parade route had very little interest in putting Kennedy in harm's way. As far as I know, the four people who were mostly involved in the parade route were Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, two of Kennedy's best friends, who were in the motorcade further back, Governor Connolly, who actually got shot, and Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells, who's never shown anything else but an incredible dismay at what happened while it was happening on his shift. He's the one who made sure that the Zapruder film, the film made by Abraham Zapruder, was identified and copied and distributed to the FBI, the Secret Service, So Forrest Sorrells has been incredibly useful in making sure that as much evidence that was available early on got taken in. None of those people suggest that they wanted to somehow get Kennedy killed and frame Oswald. If anything, if you look at a map of Dallas, it was impossible for that motorcade to go from Main Street onto Stemmons Freeway. They would have scraped the bottom of these limousines and probably destroyed a couple buses because there were cement, there were cement dividers between Main Street and Elm Street. It just was not possible without a huge engineering nightmare and possibly putting these people as sitting ducks.
You're right. You're right about that, Michel. But what's interesting is by making that turn that then takes them right in front of the depository, they violate technically one of the Secret Service rules about motorcade routes. They're never supposed to make sharper than a 90-degree turn because it slows the car up so much. And that turn right that comes on out of Main Street and then makes that turn is just a little bit over. But that's not the point. The serendipity of it is without a question. Yeah. Not only does Oswald have the job there, but when he comes into work that day with the rifle disguised as curtain rods in the bag, he doesn't know. He's never been at a presidential motorcade or event. He has no idea if there will be Secret Service in the building. They don't do that. I understand. He doesn't know if there will be Dallas police there. He doesn't even know if he can set up a sniper's nest without some of his coworkers staying on the floor with him. What if they had? And this wasn't a suicide mission in terms of, you said, maybe he was ready to be killed afterwards, but he wasn't going there to die that day. He could well have taken the rifle home if it was impossible for him to find a place to try to make the assassination on his own. But everything broke correctly for him. And it has to for an assassination to happen. Even the last shot in which otherwise Kennedy would live, if the driver of the car, William Greer, the oldest member of the security detail at 52, had started to zoom out of Dealey Plaza or had taken evasive, motions, maybe the shot would miss that just barely made it in. So, you look back at the case and it's so frustrating. It must be for Judge Griffin when they investigated it because all of the factors have to just sort of break right for the assassin, and in this case, it happens.
And the Secret Service, for a long time were moot about this, but Clint Hill and many of the others have mentioned it. Kennedy did not want to be surrounded by guards. He didn't want to look like a banana republic president.
Yeah.
Clint Hill is constantly jumping on the back of the limousine because he wants to protect Mrs. Kennedy, who, let's face it, I mean, what president would bring his wife in an open-top limousine where he knows that people want to kill him or do some harm to him? So we could say that Kennedy, kind of was a little bit careless. And in telling the Secret Service to back away from the car, so they took that turn on Elm. The problem is, how else are you going to parade through the most important thoroughfare of Dallas? I mean, I was there just a couple summers ago, and Elm Street is more industrial. It's not nice. If I compare it to Montreal, St. Catherine's Street is where you would drive a motorcade. If you try to go on Sherbrooke Street just up, it's universities and shops, but it's not really touristy. So you kind of have to come down to Main Street. And so that turn was inevitable, and it was the end of the motorcade. The highway was right there. They were going to the Trade Mart, where I think Kennedy was meant to announce one of the largest tax cuts in American history. I think it was that afternoon that was planned to be done. So I think the Secret Service figured by the time they get to Dealey Plaza, that's it. They're home free. There wasn't a need for military-style defense the way that Fletcher Prouty, made me believe for a long time.
What about the claim that the limo slowed down so the shooters could get their shot off, or even stopped?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was going only 8 to 10 miles an hour anyway. It was slow, and there is no doubt. The eyewitness testimony. You get this the perils of it. The driver testifies, William Greer, to the Warren Commission, that he turned around after the first shot. He was looking at the president. He was looking at the president as the second shot, and then he turned back around and he started to zoom out of Dealey Plaza when he heard this terrible sound behind him, and that was the headshot. The Zapruder film doesn't lie. It shows that actually William Greer responded a little later to that. He turned around and was almost looking at the president at the moment of the headshot. So the car, which was going slow anyway, slowed up even a bit more. It's going a few miles an hour. The president's in the back brace. He's wounded from the earlier shot. His head's rolled a little bit to the left. And the shooter, in this case Oswald, looking through the scope at the moment of the headshot, it looks like it's 25 yards away. He gets the clear, straight shot, 5 seconds to prepare for it. The car is not taking any evasive action. It's moving slowly, and he still almost misses. He hits Kennedy in the high right rear portion of the head. An inch and a quarter higher, it misses. We now know when Hinckley shot Reagan an inch over and Reagan would be dead. That's the difference between these sometimes being a successful assassination or not.
Yeah.
Gerald Blaine, a former Kennedy Secret Service agent, wrote a book called The Kennedy Detail. And so it's a very good book for assessing where, the Kennedy men were, what they were doing and thinking at that time. And he, by interviewing, what was the driver called again, Gerald?
William Greer.
William Greer. Greer said he thought there was a backfire on the car, or maybe a tire that had blown, so he pumped the brakes. Many people thought they heard a firecracker. Max Holland believes the first shot missed because it accidentally hit a traffic mast. So whatever people heard, many people did not think it was a bullet, a gunshot, and they thought it was something else. So Greer mistakenly thought he had blown a tire and pumped the brakes, looked back, and by then it was too late, and he started accelerating right away.
As a sidelight, one of the few people who you always wonder afterwards, are they telling you accurately or how they remember it? But Conley, who had a different view of the shooting sequence, but he was a hunter, and he said, I knew what that was. It was a rifle shot, and I started to look around at him because I wanted to see what was happening. And then, they both get hit. But Conley knew, and I do believe that the governor did know that was a bad sound.
Yeah. You can see Ike Algens of the American Press took a picture that's a very popular picture, and you can see all the Secret Service men except the one, Clint Hill, because he's looking at Mrs. Kennedy, are all turned around towards the Texas School Book Depository. And if you look through the window and you look at a very defined picture, you can actually see Governor Conley is already turning around at the time when Kennedy got shot through the throat and he through the back. So there was a shot that happened before the shot that hit Kennedy initially. And that was a big mistake. Sorry, Burt. Is a mistake I think that the Warren Commission made is assuming that the Zapruder film had captured all 3 shots. And it turns out that there was a shot that was fired before Abraham Zapruder started filming again. And that shot was shot earlier. And that's why we see the people's heads turning at the time that Kennedy gets shot in the throat. So they're already reacting to a previous shot.
And one of the things, by the way, that I don't think Judge Griffin and the Warren Commission gets enough credit for is they had the FBI doing this investigation for them in terms of the ballistics and everything else. Then they draw the conclusions as best they can. And they got it. They got the basic conclusion correct, right? Oswald kills Kennedy alone. Ruby kills Oswald. No conspiracy. Now, over the decades, there's new scientific advanced forms of ballistics testing. And when those came forward, and people have done them from the early 90s through today, they apply these different standards, ready to try to disprove the Warren Commission. There may be a difference on, yes, the timing and the exact shots, but it holds up as 3 shots. It's the same. It goes back to, so that they didn't have the science that has since come forward, but that science has always confirmed the basic conclusions of the report, which is rather extraordinary. And to your credit, Judge Griffin.
Well, not to my credit.
Thank you, Judge.
The credit of the FBI and the other staff members, but thank you for saying that. What about the bullet that was found on the back of
let's talk about the bullet too. First, though, the claim that the bullet was not as deformed as it should have been if it went through Kennedy and Connolly and did all that it did. What's the answer to that?
That's been debunked. It was debunked by the time I wrote my book. A forensics firm had actually figured out why that happens, which the FBI didn't figure out in '64. The bullet slows as it goes through the 2 men. They now know that bullet fired at 2,000 feet a second, full metal jacketed 165 grain bullet from a military rifle, how it hits them and what speed it's doing. And it's not just a theory. They then take, cadavers the size and weight of the governor and the president, and they shoot them at those speeds through those different wounds. They recreate the so-called single bullet all day long. I show in the book a copy of one of the new bullets that went through all those wounds versus another one. I've examined also the actual CE 399 at the National Archives. You have to get permission to do it. The archivist takes you in. It's with gloves. They don't let you near the bullet because they don't want you to swap it for something else. I understand that, but it's not pristine. What critics say is almost pristine. Yeah, I should have. They say almost pristine. I always say that's like saying almost pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either pristine or not. It's flattened along. It's lost a little bit of its weight, but it's in very good condition, and that it does fool people at first.
It has rifling marks, and the rifling marks, match the Carcano. So it was clearly fired, and it smashed at the bottom because it was tumbling, and like you pointed out, and people can see this. Nova did a show called Cold Case JFK 10 years ago, and Luke and Mike Haig, these forensic experts, they actually show us the bullet actually yawing through a number of different materials, ballistic soap, ballistic jelly, plywood. It hits and it goes up. And that's what it does. And presumably, now Gerald and I might disagree on the location of the shot in the back of the head, because I rely on Larry Sturtevant, another ballistics expert, but he believes the bullet also yawed in Kennedy's head. So you could have a lower bullet hole and come out. It doesn't have to go in a straight line. Bullets get deflected. So the first bullet started tumbling, and then perhaps slightly changed off course as it went through Governor Conley, who was turned. And that's why the back of the bullet is the one that embeds itself in its thigh. There's no turning left and right and pausing in midair and doing dramatic U-turns like Oliver Stone says. It's a straight line, but it's a tumbling bullet.
Yeah, no, and we know that it was tumbling because the entrance wound on Conley, his back is 1.25 inches long, which is the length of the bullet. It's hitting him on the side. One quick answer to Judge Griffin. I believe Judge Griffin, and I've written an update after 20 years. My last update was in 2003. I've written an update now for Case Closed to address in part the Paul Landis, the Secret Service recollections that he's come out with. I believe that he has provided us, if anything, we'll never know with certainty because he didn't tell the story 60 years ago when it could have been tracked down and we could have determined exactly what happened. But if he hasn't made it up out of whole cloth, the people that have spoken to him believe he's sincere. If he did find a whole bullet that day, I think he then did what he told Clint Hill, I just interviewed the other day, He said, I left it on a stretcher as we left the hospital. He didn't say I left it on JFK's stretcher. He's added that now for the book. He didn't say he found it on the back seat. I think that he found CE 399, which is that when they were taking Connolly out of the car, remember they went to get the president out of the car. I interviewed some of those people who rolled that stretcher down there. They wanted the president out right away. They didn't know he was essentially dead. They had to get Connolly out first. He's 6'5". He's in that little jump seat. They were not gentle with him. They pulled that governor out. Part of his torso's over that little jump seat. They're getting the governor out so they could get the president out. Is it possible that that bullet that had just pierced the thigh didn't pop out on the stretcher but popped out in the car? Yes. And is it possible that Paul Landis found that bullet and then committed this great dereliction of duty by not knowing what to do with it and later sticking it on a stretcher so that the chief engineer runs into it 45 minutes later? He ran into 2 stretchers. He didn't know which one it dropped off of. One of them was the stretcher it turned out that Governor Connolly had been on. So the Warren Commission made the assumption, well, it must have popped out on the stretcher. But you know what? The other stretcher was a stretcher that had been brought in for a young boy who was treated for emergency services during that time. It could have been plopped on that one. So I think that he has given us the answer to how the single bullet was found and put on a stretcher at Parkland. But I know that people will be looking for a much grander and more conspiratorial answer than that.
It's a weird story.
Okay.
It is a weird story to think, but Clint Hill doesn't defend him. Well, Clint Hill said something the other day. I did an interview for the 6th Floor Museum that I never thought of before. He said, not only were we all young, but we didn't get any counseling after. No one helped us. No one even knew about PTSD. No one sat down and said, oh, by the way, you've been through this trauma. You're going to go through these things. Clint Hill said before he left the service years later, he was drinking. He was in a dark area. All of us had different issues. So, you look back and you say, well, you didn't do this. You panicked at that moment. You were 29 years old. You put a bullet that might have killed the president in your pocket, and then you dumped it on the stretcher and you didn't tell anyone. I'm not making an excuse for him, but I do think we expect them to be operating absolutely perfectly and efficiently. And I think they were traumatized after what had happened to the president. And there were some mistakes made without any doubt. So it could have happened.
Yeah.
Well,
Burt, do you want to tell us your story about Paul Landis? Because you met him, right? You met
Paul
Paul Landis.
Asking me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
you shared
I
it
know
with me.
Paul
You may as well
Landis.
share it with these guys.
I know Paul Landis. He lives he's within walking distance of my house, and I think that he just has faulty memory, and I frankly think he's been encouraged by his spokesperson now and by his publisher to write a publishable book, and I don't think he had, unless there was this bullet that he could explain. He didn't have much to sell. I think he wrote a 6 or 7 page report to the Secret Service within a week of the assassination. He goes all the way from describing what happened from the point that they arrived at Love Field until the president's body was put on the airplane to go back in a coffin. And he goes into great detail. He doesn't mention one single thing about a bullet. I would love to have been the. I'd love to be cross-examining him at a trial. I think it's totally unbelievable. Now, why is it unbelievable? I think we need a psychiatrist to give us part of the explanation.
Well, I think Gerald touched on that with, we all think we know how we would act if X happened to us. That person's not grieving the way they should. How do you know how somebody's supposed to grieve? Therefore they're guilty or whatever.
Michael, I think that Judge Griffin says something interesting. So 60 years later, I'm going to be worried about people's recall and memory. So I think what has happened is Landis's account, one of two things. It's either fabricated or it's real. The real part is he found a bullet. So I think it's possible that it's not true at all. But if it is true, then what does it mean? And what it means for me is it's a single bullet, because the part that I can't give credence to is now he's recalled after 6 decades with specificity, oh, I found it here on the back seat. And then I think that somehow the version that he's told in the book makes him feel better and the publisher feel better which is instead of just dumping it on a stretcher as the Secret Service was walking out of the hospital because they're going to take the president back in a coffin to Washington, he's made this instance in which he puts himself into trauma room 1. And in this very dramatic moment, he looks at the president's stretcher and says, "This is where it belongs. That bullet belongs with JFK," and he puts it there. That's the part that's a bit Hollywoodish. That's the part that tries to wrap it up as though then you say to yourself, well, you know what, Landis, that was a terrible thing to take that bullet, but you did the right thing. You put it with the president. No. What really happened, if it happened at all, is he found a bullet, put it in his pocket, didn't know what to do with it. They're leaving, and he thought, oh, what the hell? And then he drops it on a stretcher. That's not a great story to tell in a book, but that's what I think might have happened.
Well, you make the point, Gerald, that memories don't get better over time, they get worse. Here is a quote I use from Dallas Morning News reporter Hugh Ainsworth, who was at Dealey Plaza and saw the assassination. Quote, "I remember interviewing people that said they saw certain things. Some did, some didn't. Even then, there were people making up things. I remember interviewing a young couple where the guy was telling me that he had seen this and he had seen that, and his wife said, 'You didn't see that. We were back in the parking lot when that happened.' Even then." The day of. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, in skepticism circles, studying conspiracism, anomaly hunting is a phrase. Anything that's any big event, people pour through and try to find anything unusual, which you can. The umbrella man, Louis Vick, what's he doing out there on a sunny day opening his umbrella? That must have been a signal for the shooters to take their shots or whatever. And it turns out, 10 years later, whatever, he comes out and says, "No, I was there to protest Kennedy, and the umbrella was a protest signal,"
But
and so on.
But you have to admit, Michael, the Kennedy assassination does have everything. So if you were going to make it up,
I know.
At the moment the president's hit, essentially, and the governor's hit, you have a guy on the side with a big black umbrella who opens it up, right? It could be hiding. I mean, you have to say that does at first glance, you think, there's something really fishy here.
Well, there's a lot of that with the whole Oswald case. I'm just pulling stuff out from Judge's book here on this conversation between, let me pull it up here, LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson. November 23rd, after the assassination, Hoover calls Johnson. Johnson says, "Have you established any more about the Oswald visit to the Soviet embassy in Mexico in September?" And Hoover says, "No, there's one angle that's very confusing for this reason. We have up here the tape and the photograph of the man at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name. That picture and the tape do not correspond to this man's voice, nor to his appearance. In other words, it appears that there was a second person at the Soviet embassy." And then in that film that you appear in, Judge, Truth is Our Client. No, it was the Nova show with you, Gerald, where they actually operatives at the embassy, and they said, no, it wasn't this other guy, it was Oswald. That's weird. I mean, what is going on there?
Well, part of that problem is the CIA. The CIA had good surveillance. They said the cameras weren't working, of course, on those embassies that day. I still have trouble believing that. They had assets inside the Cuban mission, very possibly. They still haven't disclosed that. They certainly had assets in the Mexican government who were obtaining information from the Soviet mission. The CIA immediately closed down its sources of what it would provide and share with the FBI and what would go to the commission because they didn't want to jeopardize ongoing intelligence operations in Mexico City, which was a hotbed of intelligence all the way around. So they said they were serving the investigation as much as they could, but without any risk to what was going on, to provide any information about what they had on Oswald. Still, here we are 60 years later, and I still can't say definitively what the agency might have known about Oswald's outburst, his angry outburst at the Soviet mission when he slammed his pistol on the table, or what he told the Cubans, or if the CIA picked that up, because they've obfuscated about that for years.
Right. Okay, here's another thing I hear from conspiracists when I say, well, why would the mafia or the CIA hire a wingnut like Lee Harvey Oswald? Oh, that's exactly who they want, because they want him to look like a patsy, like, oh, this guy is just a random lone nut. And that's part of the conspiracy.
Well, when you're convinced of your conclusion, you can throw in any premises that you think fits, right? It's called circular reasoning. So, but of course, if you have a fixed conclusion, you're only going to interpret the premises or allow the ones that actually help you to prove that particular point. So to me, that just shows how conspiracy thinking thinks. It goes the wrong way around. It doesn't follow the scientific method. It starts with something to prove, and then it just cherry picks ways to prove it.
Yeah,
so this would apply to Oswald in the army when he went to Japan and then Taiwan, and there was a CIA base there or something.
When I interviewed Yuri Nosenko, I was the first journalist to get to. Nosenko was the Soviet defector who had handled the Oswald file, and I said to him, "What about the fact that when Oswald came over, he had been at Atsugi, the base that had the U-2?" And he said, "We had better sources of information at Atsugi than a Marine." And I'm sure they did. They had penetrated it very well, and hopefully one day we'll get the Soviet files on that. But the point is, and I think this is critical, the idea that Oswald was working for somebody, that he was working for the mafia or whatever else, there's a very short window for that to happen, because Oswald's on a bus leaving New Orleans on September 25th to go down to Mexico City to try to get to Cuba. That's the day, that next day, that the White House announces for the first time publicly that Kennedy's going to go and visit Texas. So no one knows about a political trip until that day publicly. And Oswald then, unless you assume the Soviets and the Cubans are part of the plot, they reject him. He spends this time trying to get to Havana. He would have been in Havana on November 22nd, but he gets rejected. He comes back to Dallas near October 1st. That means that any plot, the mafia, the CIA, anybody else that wants to bring Oswald in, they have 6 weeks, 7 weeks to do it, because there's no idea of the time and place before, and nobody knows about Texas. Nobody knows Oswald's going to be there. So there's a very short window that conspiracy theorists have to focus on if they want to make their case. In that 7-week period, somebody has to contact Oswald. You can't do it by, there's no text message, telepathy, whatever else. And the Warren Commission looked at this. They were looking at the payphones around where his rooming house was. They talked to his rooming house roommates. They looked at work. They talked to Marina. They checked the phones out at Irving. There has to be a contact, and that's what's missing here. So my challenge always to conspiracy theorists, if you want to convince me that Oswald was doing it for other than his own warped motivations, then show me how he became part of this plot in this very narrow window. Forget everything else in his life, because it has to happen in those 7 weeks.
So there would need to be some paper trail. People have to be paid and
telephone, or telephone call or contact. Somebody has to get to him and say, "Lee, this is what you need to do. We're going to make sure that motorcade route is planned to come in front of a place where you're going to land a job in a week. You don't even know it yet." All right? And let's assume they don't think of it until after he gets the job at the motorcade, and they don't think of it until after the motorcade route is planned. They still have to talk to him. If he's not doing it on his own, they still have to say, "You're working for us, buddy." And that. So where is that day?
Yeah. Judge,
one thing. Sorry,
go ahead, Michel.
Well, I was going to say one thing that. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that strikes me is that once the FBI hears that Oswald had been in Mexico City, and they find their way not to Oswald but to his wife. Agent Hosty is now visiting Marina Oswald, I think at least twice, maybe 3 times. And Lee Oswald is familiar with this. We've heard about the angry note. To me, and this is just speculation, but to me this says maybe the gig is up on his attempt to kill Walker. He did try to commit an assassination 6 months earlier. He went to New Orleans because his wife didn't want him to stick around in case they found him and he got arrested. So once the FBI is closing in on where he is, there's and the president's coming to town, he may only have 7 days left, in order to do any kind of history-changing event before he's arrested for attempt to assassinate Walker. So my view is not just that he's trying to get together with Marina, he also realizes that the FBI snooping around may be saying that his whole ambition of being this great Marxist hero is coming to a close. So again, I'm speculating here, but it seems to be that Lee Harvey Oswald is a desperate man trying to put his mark on history at a time when there's this huge opportunity that rolls into town. Does his wife take him back, or does he actually do the ultimate? And he chooses to go with plan 2 because his wife didn't seem to want him back.
And the question I want to raise that I think is relevant to today is, how many Lee Harvey Oswalds are there in the United States right now who can be stimulated by the kinds of things that are going on in our society right now?
Oh, I'm sure it's a lot. I mean, this has always been a problem, probably worse now. But on that, and so that brings me to my question here. So on that James Hosty story, he's tracking Oswald, talks to Marina. Oswald shows up at his office and says, "I'm going to blow up this building if you don't leave my wife alone." In hindsight, it's like, why didn't he not see that this guy is deranged and we should really keep a close eye on him? Or is that unfair? That's the hindsight bias. After the fact, like my example is that note from Condoleezza Rice, August 6th, 2001, Osama bin Laden to strike U.S. on U.S. soil. Hakim W. didn't know that. He must have known it, and so, but there were 10,000 pieces of intelligence. And after the fact, you can find the one that said, that's what actually happened. But and so is it unfair to expect the FBI to have anticipated this?
Yes, I think so. And, Hosty intended to squeeze Oswald. He intended to come after Oswald, viewed it as harassment. But Hosty got that note before they destroyed it after the assassination. Hosty just intended to go back and stay on top of him and make sure that he put the screws on. So after the assassination, of course, then everything blows up and they think, oh, my God, I should have done something earlier. But I think it was just part of what would have proceeded as a normal security investigation, even with more effort because of that note.
Yeah, I see.
Did you interview? Can I ask Gerald? Did you interview Hosty for your book?
No, I never. I just relied on Hosty's original statements, and that was it. I don't know if he said no to me, or you forget the people that actually said no to you, or the people that just ignored you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about Kennedy and the military-industrial complex. Was he, like Oliver Stone says, about to, pull us completely out of Vietnam and was moving toward peace and so on? Or is that just part of the mythology? Anybody?
Well, I mean, it's a debate that people can have, but for me, it has nothing to do with Oswald killing Kennedy, if that makes sense. So that, you get into that issue and then you start to say, well, if you already believe that it's the secret government or somebody has to stop him. But when I look at this case and I conclude that it's this 24-year-old kid who's killing the president, I'm not going to then figure out that part of American history because it's separate from what happens in this unconnected person who's killing the president.
Yeah, I did have a section in my book where I tried to debunk the different claims of motive by different groups, and I do have a chapter on Vietnam. I call it Dominoes and Dictators. And the big thing to realize is that politics in Vietnam completely changed with the assassination of President Diem. And this happened only 2 weeks before Kennedy was himself killed. So there's no way of knowing exactly what Kennedy would have done in the future about Vietnam, because the man that they were relying on to actually kind of fight communism with American support, but not direct American intervention, a bit like, I guess, what's going on in Ukraine right now, that went away. So imagine if President Zelensky got shot and suddenly his generals took over. And if I'm reading the news right, one of these generals kind of took it upon himself to blow up the gas lines in the Baltic Ocean last year, the Baltic Sea. So then would Biden have a very different, role to play in Ukraine? And I think it's the same thing with Kennedy. Oliver Stone made a big deal of this idea of moving 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by Christmas 1963. But Kennedy had committed 10,000 troops to Vietnam, much more than Eisenhower had. So Kennedy was determined, like in Cuba, not to let the country fall to communism, or in Cuba to reverse it. But how is not quite clear. Kennedy was less trusting of the military leaders than Johnson would be, because Kennedy was he was interested in international affairs. Johnson was interested in domestic affairs. Johnson trusted the generals to hit Vietnam very hard, very quickly, and hopefully the war would be over in a year. And that didn't happen. Kennedy may have tried to do a different type of tactic, but I don't think he would have been less involved in Vietnam, just maybe a different way. So anybody who says that Kennedy wanted peace in Vietnam at all costs is absolutely wrong. There's very little evidence of that. Most of the historians that I've talked to or I've read actually would say it's a guessing game, but ultimately he was as determined to make sure Vietnam stayed democratic as he wanted Cuba to be democratic.
Yeah, in any case, if you're going to try somebody or try to get a grand jury to convict or try somebody, you have to have a person, right? You can't just say we're gonna charge the military-industrial complex with murder. Well, who's that? Or the
Right.
CIA, the entire CIA, name
Right.
names, right? And they can't. So, all right, a couple of these anomaly hunting things. All the witnesses that were allegedly intimidated and then died mysterious deaths in the years after the assassination. What's the story with
I
that?
have an appendix A in case closed. It's called the 103 non-mysterious mystery deaths. It was only 103 at the time I published. They all have an explanation as to how they died or what died. Nobody was murdered and left in a way that we didn't find out. But it's this fabulous idea that you start to put them together. And I will tell you that one of the things that's believed as a fact, it's repeated so many times. People say to me out of the blue, if I run into the Kennedy assassination, they say, well, what about all these people who have been murdered as a result of it? And it starts, of course, with Oswald and then proceeds from there. So it's one of those things repeated often enough that it's accepted as being real. And it takes some effort to prove that it's not quite the case.
Right.
Burt, I'd like to know how many witnesses did you badger or murder while you were doing your investigation?
Right. Good question.
there is a
I'm
case-
not answering.
But there is a case of a policeman, right, that you had to run in with, and I guess that's the most intense, example of. I'm not going to call it badgering.
Yeah.
But do you want to share that story? Because I thought it was great.
Well, the police officer that you're talking about is Sergeant Patrick Dean, who was in charge of security in the Dallas basement when Ruby came in and shot Oswald. We knew his job was on. I knew his job was on the line, and a big issue for us was how did he get into the basement? There was a guard at the end of the ramp entering into the basement who claimed that he was watching the basement and that he would have seen Ruby and that Ruby didn't come down. Ruby said, however, after some hesitation, that he came down the Main Street ramp. Because Dean's job was on the line, I think he had a motive not to be truthful with us about how Ruby got in. And so I suggested to him, and this, this was a terrible mistake on my part, but I went off the record, and we took a break to have a Coke or something like that, and I suggested to him that he might think the things that he was withholding from us were not relevant or important, but they were important. I did not threaten him, but I did suggest to him that if he didn't want to say anything on the record, that he might want to get a lawyer and come to us and work out some way to talk with us. He didn't go to a lawyer, an independent lawyer. He went to Henry Wade, who incidentally is the Wade of Roe v. Wade, and he went to Henry Wade, who was the prosecutor in this in the Ruby case, and he said to Wade that I had threatened him. So that's the issue here. And,
Well, on those lines, another conspiracy theory is that the evidence was planted against Oswald. The fingerprints were planted on the gun. The casings were planted in the book depository building, and so on. How did you address those claims?
Well, that wasn't my area of investigation. In fact, it must have come up much later, because in none of the discussions that I recall with my other colleagues was there a suggestion that the fingerprints were planted on the boxes.
Right, Gerald or Michel, you want to address
but
that?
assume for a second, Michael, that they were planted. So the fingerprints all around the box of the sniper's nest are planted. Fingerprints on the rifle are planted. Single bullet is planted. It's all planted. So that means Oswald truly is set up, and he didn't do the assassination. They're trying to make it look like it's him. So what does he do? He should just be hanging around Dealey Plaza, waiting, to see what's happened with the attempted assassination of the president. Instead, he's the only one of the employees who leaves. He goes back to his house. He takes a taxi for the first time in his life. He doesn't have much money. That's slow, so he gets on a bus, goes back to his rooming house to pick up his pistol, runs into a cop who stops to think he's looking suspicious and shoots him in front of a dozen witnesses, then goes and hides in the theater. All of his actions after the assassination are actions of flight. So even for people who want to say he's just a patsy, he's totally innocent, everything he does after the assassination shows he has a role, at the very least. You want to say he brought in the assassination rifle. He did that morning. He knew something about the plot, because the key thing is his own action shows you it wasn't just a matter of that his material and his fingerprints were planted. Oswald was fleeing for his life, in essence, when he left that depository within a minute and a half of Kennedy's murder.
Yeah, not to mention all the people that would have to be involved to pull that off. And not one of them has ever told their partner or pillow talk, guess what, I'm the guy that planted the evidence there or whatever, or wants to write a tell-all book or go on 60 Minutes and say what really happened. How many people would have to be involved if these conspiracy theories were true? It'd have to be hundreds.
Well, I don't know if it was Carlos Marcello, but one of the mafia dons, Michel or Burt, is quoted for saying, might be an apocryphal quote, but it's accurate. You can have a successful conspiracy with two people as long as one of them's dead.
Right.
I think Bugliosi said that.
Okay, Bugliosi.
So Vincent Bugliosi said, 3 men can keep a secret only if 2 of them are dead.
So I'm sorry.
I don't think it was his strongest premise.
That's right, but I'm sorry for recalling Vince as the head of a mafia family.
You never know. You never know.
Yeah,
Michael, I could add the 2 things that bother me the most in this whole idea of planted evidence is you would have to be able to read the future. In other words, to be able to plant a number of bullet casings or bullet fragments or bullets, you would have to know in advance how many of these are going to be found ultimately, because you might end up putting more bullets than there actually could be fired at that time, which de facto would make it, that would reveal that there was a conspiracy, more than one shooter. And even some conspiracists like Tink Thompson, who I think he's wrong on a lot of things, but he has pointed out that there are so many cameras and films that were present there in Dealey Plaza, filming or taking pictures of the scene, that to doctor something like the Zapruder film or the Mary Mormon Polaroid, you don't know in advance how many other cameras you don't know about took a picture that would contradict the one that you faked. So that is enough to say that, at least in terms of bullets and pictures, it's nearly impossible to fake it correctly, particularly 60 years on, if you don't know what other evidence lies out there.
And when that apply, I think you might have addressed this earlier, the swapped brain or the autopsy modifications and all that.
I mean, the brain, I think Gus Russo, who did a book, about 10 years ago, does a pretty good job of convincing me that brain was reinterred with Jack Kennedy when he was reinterred at Arlington, and Bobby Kennedy made sure that was the case, in part not to hide evidence, but the Kennedys were concerned, and we talked before about how they were involved of any gruesome public display that might eventually be done on the president in a future way. And so they put away those parts like that. They thought it belonged with the president. And I will say that the autopsy was not the greatest autopsy in the world. There's no question about that. One of the things was that you would think everybody assumed the autopsy of the President of the United States would be the best possible thing. The men who were doing it were well-intentioned, and I'd interviewed them, and they were good doctors, but they weren't medical examiners. And as a result, they left open enough that people could later say, well, what about that drawing? You drew the wound down here, but it doesn't show like that. You know what? We have the better evidence. The best evidence in this case, for those of us who want to look at it, are the x-rays and the photos of the autopsy. They will tell you where the shots came from that day. Now, there are people who say they were faked. The House Select Committee on Assassinations looked at that and have any evidence of fakery. They didn't find any. So you want to know what happened in the autopsy? Then you take it and you give it to medical examiners. They can look at it. Some of them disagree on it. They think it's a science. It's interpretational. But I'm convinced that those autopsy x-rays and photos show the only shots that hit Kennedy that day were fired from behind.
Yeah.
If they wanted a perfect autopsy, they should have gone to either Walter Reed Military Hospital, because that had forensic doctors there, or one of the private hospitals that was equipped to investigate crimes. But Mrs. Kennedy was convinced that he should go to a Navy hospital. She wanted to keep a tight lid on his medical conditions, and that's what happened. So again, it's that whole issue of protecting the family's legacy that unfortunately led to an autopsy that was less than perfect. I think Dr. Humes did his best, but things like Dr. Humes burning his notes, he had gone to the Lincoln Museum a couple weeks earlier and saw a chair that he believed was stained with Lincoln's blood. Turns out it may have just been the stain on the chair, but he was worried that a lot of the autopsy materials might be used as museum curios. So he destroyed anything that was not necessary that might linger around and be used for abusive reasons, and there's proof that this has happened. The autopsy pictures, and I'm thankful they got leaked because I could print some in my book, but the autopsy pictures were leaked by conspiracy theorists like Robert Groden, who stole them from the HSCA. So it's not unusual. It's not wrong that the Kennedys were worried about this. What was wrong is that they maybe went beyond their mandate to protect information from the American public that I think the American public and the world, I'm Canadian, probably are entitled to know a bit more about.
All right, one last one, way down the rabbit hole. The three tramps on the overpass resemble three people that were involved in Watergate. Have you heard this one?
Yeah. Can I go?
Yeah.
I was just teaching about this yesterday to my students. For 50 years, almost 50 years, in fact, up until a few weeks ago, Robert Kennedy Jr. said that Charles Harrelson and Frank Sturgis and Howard Hunt were these alleged hobos who were CIA agents who shot Kennedy. In 1993, a conspiracist by the name of Mary LaFontaine, I think, Gerald, maybe you mentioned her in your book, she actually found the booking slips for these three men. And I don't remember their exact names, but they were actual homeless men. They just happened to have gotten a shower and some fresh clothes the night before at a local soup kitchen or something. And that's why they didn't really look like hobos. But they were homeless men. A couple were alcoholics. They were not too proud of that. And it turns out they knew nothing about the assassination because they were found in a rail car a half a mile away from Dealey Plaza. They just happened to be marched through Dealey Plaza because from the railway, it was the fastest route on foot to get to the sheriff's office just across the plaza.
Amazing.
Yeah, and yet, for some reason, Fletcher Prouty, almost 10 years after that, before he died, was still talking about these guys as being CIA agents. It's astounding. I mean, I can forgive Robert Kennedy for just reading a few odds and ends and believing what he wants to believe, but when a person claims to be an expert on the Kennedy assassination, that's just shameful. It's either deliberately lying or having their head somewhere where the sun doesn't shine.
All right, Gerald or whoever wants to speak to this one, why haven't we seen all the documents? Why isn't the government releasing these? Every president says, I'm going to do it, and then they don't.
No,
That looks pretty bad.
It should be out. People look at it and they think they must have something to hide. The CIA is fighting the release of these. The documents that have been released show us what they are. The recent batches have been embarrassing CIA ventures in other areas. They aren't assassination related, and they're. Here's the part that I find personally so irritating. Michel and Judge Griffin may have another view on this. The CIA is saying we have to protect sources, methods of information, and operations. If our enemies do not know what sources and methods of operation and what we were doing 60 years ago, then they are worse. They're really in trouble. If the Russians and Mexican intelligence and the Cubans haven't figured out who is really betraying them 60 years ago, there's something wrong in this. And I hope that President Trump, who used to rail about the secret government in essence, would be the one to say to the CIA, no chance, I don't believe any of that, send them all out. But, he then listened to the arguments. And President Biden, I said, he has a clear recollection of the day that Kennedy was killed. He feels passionately about this. He's a Catholic president. This was a Catholic president. He'll be the one to force it out, and he doesn't. So I think that when these documents finally released, they aren't going to change the nature of the case. It will be unfortunate, and people believe in a conspiracy will just say they must have burned the important ones.
Yeah, I don't think it'll satisfy anybody. Same thing in the UFOs with the, congressional hearings. We're finally getting to the bottom of this, but they won't be satisfied unless they come out and say it's aliens. Mm-hmm. If they go, oh, it was a drone we built. No, I'm not accepting that. Right. But all of this feeds into this idea of the deep state. There is kind of a deep state. There is stuff going on we don't know about.
we had Iran-Contra, we had the lies over Watergate. We knew how that played out. We've seen situations in which the government at times in the deep state can conspire against the best interests of the American people. So when I conclude, but for instance, that Oswald alone killed Kennedy, I'm not saying the deep state is an ideal thing and the CIA is always wonderful and they're doing things that don't hurt American interests. There are conspiracies, sometimes the government even working against or lying to us on different aspects, but that's not what happened in this case. So people assume that if you say Oswald alone, you're also debunking the idea of any other conspiracies existing, or that somehow you think the CIA and the NSA and the FBI don't think things wrong. I had a book called, Why America Slept, castigating the intelligence agencies for their failure to stop 9/11 as a preventable thing. So, they make mistakes, they do errors, at times they even plot. They didn't do that in this case, though.
Yeah.
I had a person on my podcast called Mike Lofgren. I have his book here, The Deep State. And as far as he's concerned, and he's worked in Congress for 30 years as an aide to the, I think it was the one of the military subcommittees. And to him, the deep state is a revolving door between private business and elected politicians. Every 2 years, a congressperson has to seek re-election. And that means the day after they're elected, they're already starting to campaign. And they can't campaign, they can't ask for funds from inside Congress, so they have to go across the city to a rented office, which often is paid for by some of their supporters or by various lobbyists. And so the relationship is incestuous between people with interests, think tanks, etc., and the elected officials. So it was very interesting to listen to Mike Lofgren on this, because it tells you, yes, there's a deep state, but maybe it's not this swamp that Donald Trump tells us about. It's something much more mundane. It's just the way that money changes hands, that people like Dick Cheney easily go from the political establishment to serving in a private corporation, and then back into the arms of into the political institutions. It happens in a lot of countries, but I think in the United States is a particular issue there of the power of lobbyists.
Yeah. One of my favorite episodes on Rogan was Ed Snowden. And, Rogan loves the whole conspiracy stuff, the backroom cigarette smoking guys running the world. And the Snowden goes, let me tell you what it's actually like. It's just guys trying to keep their jobs and departments trying to keep their budgets. And exactly what you said, if we don't spend all this money and if we don't ramp up the threat of terrorism, then they're going to cut our budget. So it's just people trying to keep their jobs. All right. So, I had another thought on the 9/11 truthism. In terms of what you were saying, Michelle, about having to anticipate the future. If they planted bombs in the buildings, they would have had to know ahead of time which floors the planes were going to hit, because that's where the collapse of the buildings started, right? At the plane hit. So they'd have to know, okay, the planes are going to have to be remotely controlled and hit on these floors at this angle, because that's where we put the explosive devices and so on. So much of the Kennedy assassination is like that. You'd have to know 100 things in advance, which is impossible.
Killing a man in broad daylight is probably a very hard thing to do and get away with. Why not just, I was talking to an independent filmmaker called James Lambert. He says, why didn't they just poison him, And he said this to Jesse Ventura in Dealey Plaza on the 40th anniversary. He told Jesse Ventura, why didn't they just poison him in his sleep, feign a heart attack, and then put in Johnson? Or in my case, I would say, why not just put a bomb in one of those manholes on Dealey Plaza? You could be 20 miles out of town when you press them. It's like I said, circular reasoning. You take whatever evidence will fit the idea that you think Kennedy was assassinated by a conspiracy, and you force it to make it fit, and you ignore everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, the first time I went to Dealey Plaza, I was amazed at how small it is. Yeah. Because in your imagination, it's this huge thing, and then you go up to the Book Depository Building Museum, and you look down, and they got the two X's on the road. It's like, well, that's right there. I mean, this is not a hard shot.
I've never shot a rifle, so I don't know. But I was astounded at the incline of Elm Street, because everybody had told me, oh, it's very small, it's very small. I got there, I was expecting that, But what I was surprised at is when you're standing at the corner of Elm and Houston, that it's a much sharper incline going down the hill towards the underpass than you can tell on pictures. So that when you're in the 6th floor, the next day I went into the museum and I was able to look out the window. You go, well, I guess a rifleman, it's a pretty straight shot,
right.
and there's not a lot of adjustment necessary, because as the car is moving away from you, it's kind of just following the natural incline of the rifle. I don't know if I guess you looked at this, Gerald. I know many members of the Warren Commission, had to do reconnaissance there. What did you guys think?
No, you're absolutely right, Michel. It's a much easier shot in that pulling away from the shooter. And I've spoken to people who are, in fact, avid shooters, that they also answer the question as to why Oswald doesn't take this shot that some think is easier when the car is moving toward the depository, because that would expose him to the other buildings like Dow Tex. He'd have to be front and center in the window with his rifle. All the neighboring towers around him would be looking right at him. The way that the sniper's nest is set up, all you really see is a little bit of his face, possibly if you look, but you see the rifle butt coming out. You have to be looking up there. That's why only 2 witnesses see it. And so there's another thing is, in terms of a shooter, the target coming toward you keeps dropping underneath your scope, dropping underneath your vision. So you have to keep it on in a different way. That aim where it's pulling away from you, you're right, you're following it, that shot straight on, and that's a shot that he can make.
And a Marine would have known that, a guy who was able to be marksman on a number of occasions.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Well, that's what the Warren Commission, tracked down his actual riflery record, which was useful. Yeah. Bill Yossi makes a point at the beginning of his book that he was at a trial lawyer conference, and he asked right after the JFK Oliver Stone film came out, and he asked, how many of you think that the Warren Commission didn't get it right and that Oswald didn't act alone? Every hand goes up. How many of you have seen JFK? Oh, every hand goes up. Right. How many of you have read the Warren report? One hand goes up. Oh, right. So here are trial lawyers who's saying, I don't need to read anything. I already know what happened. That's pretty discouraging.
You're going to read it in the bath.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, just another point you made, Judge, how can we stop this from happening? There must be a lot of people like this now. I see it as kind of a signal detection problem that, there's probably a lot of terrorists walking around and deranged people and so on. We can't lock everybody up we suspect of a crime. This isn't the Minority Report because we live in a free society. So in a way, the kind of thing Oswald got away with is the kind of thing that would happen in a free society. Otherwise, you're living in North Korea where that kind of thing can't happen, but then you have no freedoms. So in a way, I guess we're willing to trade off allowing the Oswalds of the world to get away with stuff so that the rest of us can mostly be free most of the time, except for having to take our shoes off in the airport because of that guy, the shoe bomber guy. But, that would be an example of the counter problem there.
I mean, even if we were North Korea, I don't think we would have picked up Hinckley. You understand? We might not have picked up Brenner shooting on Oswald. I mean, shooting on Wallace. I mean, it's hard. I don't even think James Earl Ray would have been picked up. He wasn't involved in any hate groups or whatever else. It's unusual. So it's we use that term lone wolf, but it's the individual on their own, not connected really to an extensive group, who sort of comes through. We're very good at keeping an eye on the hate groups, the extremist groups, getting somebody from the FBI to penetrate as an undercover, and then you try to find out what's going on, and then sometimes we're successful or not. But these people who are doing it for their own unusual motivations, not necessarily the traditional ones. Impressing Jodie Foster is not one that would pop up on the radar, so I don't think we could stop it anyway.
That's right.
Yeah, we had 2 people like that in Canada not that long ago in Toronto. There was one of those incels, a young man who drove a truck right through crowds. Why? Because he couldn't find a woman who wanted to sleep with him. Yeah. Here in Montreal, it was a while ago, but there was a shooting at the University of Montreal that killed 14 women. Now, this guy wasn't a Marxist, but he was an anti-feminist. In fact, there's a family connection. My father was friends with that young man's mother. And so, his name was Marc Lépine. His father was Algerian, broken home. He was an abusive father, broken home. His mother worked double shifts. He ended up having to live with friends of the family a lot of time. There's a very similarity sometimes between these life stories. The ideology they pick up along the way is different, but there's usually an experience of helplessness, of anger. Sometimes there are personality types who find it very hard to exteriorize their feelings. Even if they had a psychologist, they probably wouldn't feel comfortable sharing these things. And they find someone to hate, and eventually they unload. Like Gerald said, it's almost impossible to identify these people, at least not for the law enforcement. It might be harder for certain, like a school psychologist might be able to pick them up, but they might only see this kid in high school when they'll commit that crime 5-8 years later. So it's very hard to predict.
Well, we can predict potential targets. I think we cannot identify who's going to be the shooter or the assailant.
Right.
So we've got to figure out ways to protect the target, and of course, one thing that's been done as a result of the Kennedy assassination is I think there are no longer any motorcades, presidential motorcades. But you've got to avoid taking certain kind of risks, and unfortunately, then go ahead, Gerald.
No, I was going to say, Judge Griffin, you're right. Just before I have to leave you all in just a couple of minutes at 2 p.m. Eastern time, but I want to say one thing. You're right when you say no more motorcades, but what do the presidents do? When running for office or re-election, they pick a time at which they just stop the cars and they get out and they mingle with the crowds. Now it's supposed to be just spontaneous, so no one knows when it's going to happen. You'd have to have the luck of being a bad luck of being the assassin in that crowd with a pistol and ready to attack the candidate. But there are these moments in which Obama, Trump, Biden. Biden no, because it was the pandemic. But in every other case, they stop the car on the way back to the White House and they want to show the pictures of the president being accessible. So there's that balance. And the Secret Service, you could tell they don't like it. But we do it, and then hope that that no one's there who's armed and ready to try to do something.
Right.
Yeah, another one. I'll wrap it up here. Another one of those skeptics quotes is, never attribute to malice what can be explained by randomness or incompetence. Except I wouldn't apply that to Putin these days.
True, absolutely true.
Yeah, he does assassinate people. Also, the randomness of people not even knowing they themselves are going to do something, like these school shooters. There's such a randomness to it. I was thinking about this with there's a database of people who try to commit suicide and fail, and then why? Why did you do it? And usually they go, I don't know. Something came over me that day. It wasn't something I plotted for a long time. I just all of a sudden snapped. And I think a lot of it is just that. And, after the fact, we go back and go and try to connect the dots and make it something deeply meaningful. But so much of life is just randomness like that.
Agreed.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. We're up on 2 hours here. And I know you guys got other interviews to do for the big 60th anniversary. Thank you so much for all your books, your work, and your public appearances and all this stuff. Hopefully we won't have to do it in 10 more years at the 70th anniversary.
Thank you, Michael.
More books.
Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Thank you, Burt and Gerald. It
Yeah,
was great
thank you.
to see
And
you guys.
Michelle, thank you. And Judge Griffin, thank you for your books, both of you. Thank you.
So long to
Thank you.
everybody. Okay.
All right.